Davion tossed a file onto my desk. I know you didn't want to take on any more cases for a while, Melissa, but I think we need to at least look into this one. I nodded. I wasn't ready to dive back into this work, not after our last case. Everything was still too raw. Davion knew that better than anyone, so if he thought we needed to take a look, it meant it was serious. I grabbed the file and opened it up. Can you give me an overview while I look through the documents? Davion pulled out the chair on the other side of the desk and sat down with a sigh. Of course, he said. The documents in the file were in an envelope that had been shoved through the mail slot. After I skimmed through them, I knew I needed to open a file. The only communication with whoever left this is the note on top. I nodded, reading the note. We've been trying to handle this the normal way. It isn't working. Nothing is working. My husband is against trying supernatural stuff, says it's the work of the devil. I'm desperate. We need help. I can pay. Please look over the documents here and meet me tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. at La Boulangerie. I'll be wearing a red cap. Don't call. My husband will forbid this if he finds out. Francine Michiel. So, we know Francine here's in a bit of a pickle, but the note doesn't tell us what the pickle is. The rest of the stuff in the folder will help clear some of that stuff up. There's the usual photos of strange phenomenon that are never as revealing or shocking as people think. A copy of a letter from the principal of Oak Meadows Junior High School that details a sudden change in behavior of one Anthony Duplais. From the context of the letter, it sounds like Anthony is Francine's stepson. His father, Carmichael Duplais, is Francine's husband, and his mother, Genevieve Ducharme, died 3 years ago. Carmichael and Genevieve split 2 years before her death. I found all that through some internet sleuthing. Printouts of the news articles are in the file. I'm surprised all their personal business was that easily accessible, I said. We lucked out that Carmichael is mildly wealthy, just enough that people want to read about the torrid bits of his personal life on gossip sites. I huffed. Sometimes I found the beings I cast out to be less repulsive than the people I shared a planet with. Anyway, Davion continued, what's noteworthy is that Genevieve died under mysterious circumstances. A neighbor heard screams and called the cops. When they got there, they found Genevieve dead. She was in the tub. It seemed she'd settled in for a bath. Bruising around her throat made it easy to determine that it was death by strangulation. What really confused the investigators was that all the doors and windows were locked and deadbolted from the inside. No one could have gotten out without leaving something unlocked. But you'll never guess the really weird part. Davion paused, clearly wanting me to ask, which is... The coroner noticed the bruise didn't look right. It should be a specific shape based on the shape of hands, fingers on the outside, thumbs crossing the middle. This looked almost the opposite of that. So she did some unorthodox examining and discovered that the bruising and the positioning matched perfectly with Genevieve's hands. She strangled herself with her own hands. Fascinating, I said. That should be almost impossible. Exactly. You'd pass out before death, the muscles would relax, and you'd stop choking yourself. And Genevieve wasn't exactly muscular. She was very thin and petite, with minimal musculature. She shouldn't have even had the physical capacity to strangle herself, even if she could maintain consciousness. Choking someone to death is a surprisingly strenuous task. So, you found all that in your research? Bits and pieces, but Francine actually included the police report in the file. I was curious at first, but then I noticed she had circled the date of Genevieve's death in the report. Did some digging back through the rest of the material and saw that the date very close corresponds with the date of Anthony's sudden shift in behavior. That makes perfect sense, though, I said. His mom dies, he's struggling to deal with it, that comes out as problematic behavior. Really sad, but unbearably normal. I agree. Not quite the smoking gun I imagine Francine thinks it is. Then let's cut straight to the point, I said. Why do you think we should take this case on, now of all times? Genevieve took her mother's maiden name when she turned 18 to try to distance herself from her father. It wasn't that he was abusive, as far as I know, at least, but his name definitely garners some notoriety. Genevieve's original last name was de Bonvillain. Genevieve de Bonvillain. Don't tell me she was the daughter of Pierre de Bonvillain? Exactly that. I could see why she'd want to distance herself from that name. Imagine being the daughter of the man who started the sect of devotion. No kidding, Davion said. Poor girl. I nodded. But I still don't see why that makes this urgent business for us. The sect of devotion was a deeply problematic cult, but it was all a bunch of flash with no substance. I was looking into them a bit when I found out that Genevieve's father was Pierre de Bonvillain, went down the research rabbit hole, was studying some images of one of their ceremonies to their supposed higher power, Tarovs. Always thought that was a stupid name. While I was working on that, I had to pee. Really glad you're sharing that. Oh, hush. Anyways, when I stood up, I saw the image in the mirror, and it stopped me fucking cold. Hopefully you still made it to the bathroom in time. What was so much more disturbing about the ceremony when viewed in reverse? Tarovs. In the mirror, I saw it backwards. We should have thought of it sooner. A being from a backwards realm would play with mirror images. The cult of devotion was worshipping Severet. Oh, shit. I was 15 minutes early for my rendezvous with Francine, but I saw a woman with a red cap already there. Francine? I asked. The woman looked up at me. She had dark bags under her eyes, which was the only color on her otherwise sickly pale face. Are you the investigator? She asked, her thick Quebec accent immediately apparent. I am. My name is Melissa. Francine nodded and motioned to the chair across from her at the small two-person table. I pulled it out and sat down. I looked at her, waiting for her to begin. When she said nothing while studying the cup of tea in front of her, I realized she might need some prompting. I read the documents you left for us, I said. Francine nodded but said nothing. Francine, I'll need you to communicate with me if I'm going to be able to help you, I said. I thought I could talk about it, but when I try it's like something has a grasp on my throat and squeezes it so tight the words can't slip out. Maybe I can just show you. It isn't far. Come with me. Before I could respond, Francine stood up from the table and began to walk towards the door. I saw her tea, still steaming, left behind on the table. Forgotten. I had no choice. If I wanted to pursue this case, I couldn't lose my only source of information. I stood up and hurriedly walked after Francine. She pushed through the door and walked out onto the sidewalk. I hustled to catch up with her. Francine, I said, where are you taking me? Not much further, she said, not actually answering my question. At the nearest intersection, Francine turned left, heading into the older part of the city. Francine, seriously, where are we going? 1 block up. Then we take a left into the alley by a bookstore. I can show you more of what my family is dealing with there. Think of it as the first breadcrumb to follow on the path to the witch's house, and you are Gretel. That's not actually how the story goes, but I get the metaphor you're trying to make. Fantastic. Then follow me. We made it to the bookstore and then headed down the alley. The alley hooked behind another building before turning yet again, and I realized that we were at a dead end that was completely hidden from the road. Something didn't feel right. Francine, what's... My voice caught in my throat. It was Francine's eyes. They were completely white. No iris, no pupil, just clouds of white seemingly moving with some unknown current just below the surface. She turned to look at me, and when her eyes looked into mine, I felt a chill pass over me. It felt like being frozen from the inside, like my heart was chilled while my skin still felt the warmth of the sun. I could feel it spreading to my lungs. I couldn't move. My brain seemed too frozen to function, to tell my legs to take steps to run away from this danger. Then the sound of footsteps distracted Francine. She glanced away, and it was just enough to let me crack the ice inside me and regain control. I whipped around toward the sound. Davion came running into the cul-de-sac. The thing is, a lot of times people seem to assume that because I work in the field of the supernatural, I must be a kook. And if I'm a kook, I must be stupid. I'm sure me being a woman doesn't make a positive impact in many people's estimations, either. But if you were to ask any of the entities I fought, which you can't because I dispelled all of them, you'll find that planning and strategy are my strongest qualities. That said, you don't have to be a master strategist to know not to go meet a stranger alone. Davion is always my lookout for meetings. He'd been scoping out the scene for almost an hour before my assigned meetup time. When we left, I knew he would wait a minute and then follow us. I'd been afraid we lost him in the alleys, but Davion is sharp and has a nose for stalking people. Luckily, he uses that power for good. Unluckily, he can't see around corners. Davion tore around the corner, not realizing we had stopped at a dead end. Francine turned on him and locked stairs. The freezing I had been feeling before must have hit him, because I saw his eyes glaze over as he stumbled and crashed to the ground. He lay there, unmoving. I screamed and ran at Francine. I rammed straight into her. Francine's feet came out from under her as she fell, slamming down into the alleyway. There was a sickening hollow crack at that, based on the blood pouring out of her scalp. I could only assume was Francine's skull connecting with the asphalt. I staggered from the blow, but was able to keep my balance. Looking around, I ran over to where Davion lay on the ground. Sliding my knees next to him, I checked his body. He was shivering, despite being warm to the touch, and there was a bruise on his cheek where he must have hit when he crashed to the ground. He wasn't conscious, but his breathing was steady. The sound of grit moving against asphalt caught my attention, and I looked back over my shoulder. Francine was getting up. Her face was covered in blood rolling down from her hairline. I quickly rummaged in my pockets and pulled out the only defense I had, 2 small batons with buttons about a third of the way from the end I was holding. I ran at Francine, who was just staggering to her feet. With a powerful swing of her arm, she swatted me across the upper arm and sent my body flying across the alley to slam into the back of a brick building. The pain was extraordinary. I felt some things pop and crack when my body connected with the building, and everything got even more stirred up when I fell to a slump on the ground. I needed to get back up, but the pain was overwhelming me. I needed to buy some time. Fortunately, in my experience, most of these beings like to talk. "I know this isn't you, Francine," I gasped. "So who is in charge of Francine's body?" A different voice emerged from Francine's mouth, one that was deep and sharp, filled with the gravel of eons spent somewhere else.
"I am Little Mitsa. I know you. As you've been hunting me, I've been hunting you."
The voice was terrifying on its own, but it wasn't just the voice that made my hands tremble. I recognized this voice. I had to say it, to make sure, but my voice trembled so bad I barely got it out. "Severet?"
"I am pleased you recognized me,"
the voice said from Francine's body. "I assumed you would be." The voice laughed. It sounded like a tidal wave of molten metal.
"Of all the hunches I have slaughtered, you will always be my favorite. I love the fire in you."
I was slowly grounding my body in some sense of functionality. I pushed myself up and stood up. I felt like I was wobbling, but I did my best to hide it. "You haven't slaughtered me yet," I said. Francine began walking towards me. Her eyes had begun to take on a redder hue, like flows of blood moving in her eye sockets. Her skin became paler before my eyes, the veins standing out in her face, her neck, and her hands. Her nails seemed to elongate into claws as she reached out for me. I tried to move away, but I still hadn't regained all my faculties. Francine's hand gripped my neck, her nails piercing my skin and slowly sliding deeper and deeper into the muscles in my neck. I screamed in pain as the shredded muscles burned. Francine yanked me closer to her, close enough almost to kiss me, and stared into my eyes. Her mouth opened and dark mist began to pour from her.
"I will have you, Melissa. I will penetrate your mind, your will, your voice, your body. All will be mine to control."
As Francine's face lurched closer to mine, I fought through the pain and fog in my mind. I swung up the batons and pressed the buttons. A piercing, vibrating note burst from them. It made me immediately nauseous, but the effect on Francine was far more notable. she screamed, and it was a mix of the voice I had heard when we first met, which I assumed was her usual voice, and the voice of Severet. Blood leaked from Francine's eyes, but the color started to return to her skin, and her nails began to retake a less animalish shape.
I am leaving this body for now,
Severet spat from Francine's mouth.
But this is far from over. You will see me again, and our first encounter will look like child's play compared to the violence I will commit on your soul. I will see you at the Duplais household, I'm sure.
With a final scream, I felt an invisible force rush from Francine's body. She crumpled to the ground, unconscious. I staggered over to the building that butted against the alley and fell against it. I was afraid if I sat down I wouldn't be able to get back up, but I also knew I couldn't stand under my own power. Davion was alive, but injured. Francine's body was currently free from Severet's violent usage, but it was likely only an empty shell now. And I was battered. Physically and mentally. The first time I fought Severet had ended in tragedy. I don't know how I was able to escape relatively unscathed this time, but when he said he was going to be doing terrible things to me in the near future, he meant it. Davion had been right. Anthony Duplais needed our help. I had wanted to block out the horrors of my first fight with Severet, but if I wanted to have any chance to help Anthony, I'm going to need to delve back into the most terrifying moments of my life to search for clues. I'm not sure my soul will survive this process. The steady, rhythmic beep seemed to shift from comforting to annoying to background noise in a semi-regular cycle. Currently, I found peace in knowing that the beeping was continuous confirmation that Davion was still alive. The police were skeptical when I explained what happened, but at this point, they're pretty used to me being involved in weird stuff. Fortunately, the medics didn't stop long enough to get lost in the details and rush Davion to the hospital. He was in pretty rough shape. His brains were pretty rattled from the fall, and his eye managed to smack a hunk of loose gravel that was large enough to cause some damage. He had some increased pressure in his skull, but luckily that went down over time. He should be on the road to recovery, but it was scary for a little bit. It seems that the internal freezing, for lack of a better term, didn't do any lasting harm, so at least there's that. But there's an even bigger problem. Severet is back. He took over Francine Michiel, attacked me and Davion, and then left Francine's body a warm husk. Severet seems to be involved in Anthony Duplais's concerning shift in behavior, and, to top it all off, his mother died under mysterious circumstances, and he just so happens to be the grandson of Pierre de Bonvillain, the founder of the sect of devotion, which, it turns out, may have been worshipping Severet this whole time. With a web of connections this complicated, I feel like I'm in some supernatural soap opera. I went to the hospital to be with Davion as soon as the police were finished with their questions. I need to figure out how to remove Severet from Anthony's life, but running over there without a plan would be a good way to get everyone involved killed. Davion's room at the hospital would give me a place to think. My last case started out pretty benign. Davion and I, along with two other members, Amelie and Cosette, investigated the issue. I was new to the province and had found a family of sorts with this group. I'd been looking for a fresh start after my disastrous time in Montana. The less said about that, the better. We had begun investigating some weird references to a being named Severet floating around online. Usually, the internet is an absolutely awful place to do our research. Way too many crackpots and conspiracy theories, but the references to it were also referencing elsewhere, and that got a huge reaction from Amelie. I can't go back there, she stammered, terrified as soon as we mentioned elsewhere. What is it? I asked.
No one knows,
Davion said.
If Amelie hadn't actually had first-hand experience with it, I'd assume it was more neo-magician nonsense.
Cosette nodded. Amelie? She asked gently. Would you be able to help us out with some info?
I just...
Amelie broke down in sobs. Cosette gave her a hug, holding Amelie in her arms while she sobbed.
I went there as a child,
Amelie said. Minutes later, when the overwhelming emotions began to drop back down to a simmer. I was so little, only 7, but this horrible thing stole me out of my dreams and hid me deep down in the elsewhere. It said things to me that I can never unhear, and then it left me there and took over my body. It did horrible things to me. I was trapped in the elsewhere for months before someone finally pieced together that it wasn't just bad behavior. And I was saved. As we asked Amelie more questions, we realized that she didn't actually know that much about it, other than what she had lived firsthand. The trauma was still very present for Amelie. We decided to not let her participate anymore in the case, both for her own safety as well as ours. We didn't want her to freeze up in a critical moment. It wouldn't be her fault, but it could still lead to an injury or death for any of us. The research didn't get us very far. Severet was sometimes called a demon, sometimes a djinn, sometimes a spirit. There were people who claimed it had possessed them. Most of them described it as horrible. Some simply said it was like being in a fog and they couldn't remember much. And one memorable person described a sexual encounter with the being while they were possessed by it that was far more than I would ever have hoped to know. In a nutshell, the internet research gave us what you would expect it to: some disagreeing evidence and a weird sex story. We had run completely out of ideas, and since the references we had found were few and undetailed, we decided it was probably just an urban legend that had taken root online, a Slender Man for the esoterica crowd. 3 weeks later, a news story popped up about a suicide victim who had carved the name Severet into their chest before slicing their own throat. That got our attention. A week later, another person was found, a college student who had just been accepted into med school. The next month, it was a local government official. The cops began to suspect a serial killer was at work, someone who had found a way to make each of these murders look like a suicide. But if the killer had gone through all the work to fake the suicides, why had they done something so obviously connected as carving the same name into the chest of each? 3 days after the government official, while we were sitting in the small kitchen area we used as a break room, Cosette turned to Amelie and said,
I've missed you, little Amelie. You've grown up so much since I last saw you all those years ago.
Cosette's voice wasn't Cosette's voice. It was gravely and deep, with a violent menace I didn't think Cosette could ever be capable of. Amelie screamed. Cosette laughed a deep, brutal laugh.
Do you recognize me, little one?
Amelie's eyes began to twitch and spin, and she collapsed to the ground. Cosette turned to face me.
My name is Severet,
she said in a voice that wasn't hers.
I believe you've been doing a bit of researching on me. I'm honored, truly.
I didn't know what to say, if I could even get any words out of my mouth, so I said nothing.
Cat got your tongue. It happens, I suppose.
Cosette picked up a knife from the table where she had been spreading mayo on her sandwich and moved towards me. Whoa, wait, what are you doing? I said, knowing the answer.
I want to consume you. I want you to be my next suicide.
Why me?
You just look so pathetic. No one would doubt you snapped, killed your friends, and then yourself.
Cosette lunged at me, hooking disturbingly claw-like nails into my arm. I screamed in pain. I tried to fight off Cosette, but her strength seemed magnified by Severet. Her free hand went around my throat, squeezing tight. It immediately cut off my air, and I flailed at her, panicking. Right as the edges of my vision started to go blurry, I heard a hard thud, and suddenly the vice around my neck was released. I fell to the floor, gasping for air. Looking up, I saw Davion standing above me, the fire extinguisher in his hands. Cosette had crumpled to the ground next to me, and I scooted myself away. I hit her in the head with a fire extinguisher, Davion said. I don't think she's going to be getting up from that too soon. I can't be near her, not until I know that creature is out of her. Davion helped me up and brought me over to the couch. I fell back into it and sat there while he got me water. What just happened? I asked. Severet just happened, he replied. I'll be right back. I should check on Amelie. As he stood back up, there was a piercing scream. My eyes shot up and I looked across the room. The image has never left me. Cosette has gotten back up and taken off her shirt. She still had hold of the knife and was already most of the way through carving Severet's name into her chest. The scream had come from Amelie, who woke up just in time to see the horrifying mutilation. Davion ran to Cosette to try and stop Severet, but he was too far away. Cosette's hand reached up and drew the knife across her throat. The blood geysered out, spraying Davion in the face. I remember screaming coming from all three of us before things got foggy again. Amelie never recovered. She left our little group a few days later. I tried to check in on her, but when I went to her apartment, she had moved out. No forwarding address left behind. The case closed because Davion and I were too rattled to dive right back in. It was too personal. Thought it might be time to reach out to some colleagues, have someone else take over the investigation. This was when Davion dropped the Anthony Duplais case file on my desk. I looked over at him, unmoving on the bed. Were there any clues? Any takeaways from our last encounter with Severet? Anything I could use against him now? Not even a little bit. But it was all I had. So what now? The smart thing to do would be to get back up. Fortunately, I knew some people in the field. I picked up my phone. I had some calls to make. I was headed to the Duplais home, hoping that I'd be able to rid the family of Severet and also not die. I was worried that might be impossible. I'd made a number of calls from Davion's room in the hospital and had very little luck. When I mentioned Severet's name, my contacts suddenly weren't available. One, a little braver than the others, told me I needed to let this case go, that the Duplais family was already beyond saving, and it wouldn't help anyone if I decided to die along with them. Only one person didn't say no. Father Jeremy Levine. Father Levine looks as though he might be old enough to have met Jesus. Thin, rickety frame, spindly arms and legs, bald head, unkempt white beard. He sat beside me in my small car, wearing all black except for the white collar. I was pretty sure if I accidentally bumped him, he would fall apart into a pile of old man pickup sticks and dust. But he was all I had. When I mentioned Severet, Father Levine had made a huffing noise over the phone.
"I will help you,"
he said, his voice whispery and his words abrupt.
"This demon needs to return to Enfer."
I don't believe he is actually a demon, I said.
"He is from another place. He possesses people and makes them do evil, and he is a bastard. What difference does it make what we call him?"
That makes a lot of sense. We had agreed to meet up, and I filled him in on the way to the Duplais home. Father Levine brought a black satchel with him, and when the car turned, I heard the soft rattle of glass on glass. The house Anthony Duplais and his family lived in was quite large. Not a mansion, but definitely had more than twice as many rooms than people who lived there. I knocked on the door and was greeted by a broadly built, clean-shaven man who appeared to be in his 40s. Hints of gray around the temples and his otherwise dark hair. The bags under his eyes spoke of stress and far too little sleep.
"Can I help you?"
"Hi, Mr. Duplais. I'm Melissa Stark. He raised his hand to stop me.
"You were the one who was with Francine when she was hurt?"
He asked. Yes, I was.
"I don't trust this hocus-pocus nonsense you're peddling, but Francine did, and the cops said you had a big role in saving her life. Come in. I assume you're here about Anthony?"
He stepped aside, and Father Levine and I stepped inside. Mr. Duplais directed us towards a small sitting room off the main foyer. "Yes, we are," I said. "Mr. Duplais." He interrupted me again, which seemed to be a habit of his, but at least he was pleasant.
"Please, call me Carmichael,"
he said. "Sure. Carmichael, Francine contacted us about Anthony. She was worried for him, and the more evidence my colleague and I found, the more we agreed with her. It appears as though a being named Severet is using Anthony's body and trapping Anthony in another dimension called Elsewhere." Carmichael just stared at me for a moment before speaking.
"Do you think I'm stupid, or are you so crazy that you can't hear yourself?"
"I can help Anthony," I said.
Please? With a crock of shit like that, you can't help anyone.
If I may, Father Levine intervened. Carmichael glanced over at the father, and some of the fire in his eyes immediately began to die down. Clearly, Carmichael had more respect for religious figures than supernatural investigators.
While I disagree with Melissa on a number of foundational philosophical and cosmological tenets, she is right that your son is in danger and that we can help him.
Father Levine pointed to a cross hanging on a wall in the foyer, just visible through the open door.
You appear to be a God-fearing man, Carmichael. Trust me, and let us save your boy.
Carmichael took a few seconds to ruminate, but finally he nodded.
Good,
Father Levine said.
Then take us to young Anthony.
Carmichael led us upstairs. Deeper into the large house, we came to a bedroom, and Carmichael knocked before opening the door.
Hey, son,
he said as he stepped into the room.
It's Dad. I've got a couple people with me to see you.
The room was typical teenager fare. Some dirty clothes on the floor, stacks of school books on a desk, posters of bands on the wall. Anthony was lying on his bed, holding a book that I assumed he'd been reading before we interrupted him. He didn't say anything, just stared at us as we walked in.
Anthony,
Carmichael said.
This is Miss Stark and Father Levine. They know Francine. They're here to help you.
I know who they are,
Anthony said in a deep, gravelly voice I immediately recognized.
Anthony, you sound off,
Carmichael said.
That's because Anthony is at home right now,
Severet said, using Anthony's mouth.
Get out now. Leave us to work,
Father Levine said, ushering Carmichael out. As soon as he got the door shut behind Carmichael, Father Levine locked the door behind us. There was a banging and shouting from the other side of the door, but I quickly tuned it out as Severet began to speak again.
Melissa, good to see you again. Between the adventure with Francine and having to watch your friend bare her chest to my bloody name, I had feared you wouldn't return. I do love our time together, even when I threaten you and say otherwise.
Anthony turned to face the father.
But you are new, Father Levine. Well, new to me. Clearly not new, you old man.
I beat your mother to an inch of her life to stop her evil acts, but I took pity on her and spared her life. If I hadn't, you would not be here. I will balance mercy with countering evil more vigilantly today.
Wow. Damn. Oh man, you've got some spice to you.
Father Levine opened his bag and pulled out 2 glass vials. He opened one and let it dribble in a circle around Anthony's bed. Severet laughed.
I'm not some demon, you stupid old hack. Yet your kind have been held in check by the trappings of belief for as long as humans have existed. Your bravado is misplaced.
With a roar, Anthony exploded from the bed and ran at Father Levine. Claw-like nails extended, he swiped right as the father opened another bottle and splashed the contents at Anthony. Severet's scream was horrible to hear. Steam rose up from Anthony as he staggered, falling back on the bed. Blood dribbled down Father Levine's cheek where the nails had ripped through his skin. Father Levine whirled towards me.
I need you to trust me,
he said. I had no other options. I do, I said. He reached in his satchel and pulled out a green vial. He tossed it to me.
Sit down and drink this, he said. It will help you find your way to elsewhere. Call to Anthony and you will find him. Bring him back.
I nodded and looked around. A chair in the corner would do. I ran over to it and plopped down. There was a cork stopped in the vial. I ripped it out violently, and before I could reconsider, I threw it back like a shot. It tasted of honey and mold, and immediately I found myself drifting off to unconsciousness. I looked up and saw Father Levine splashing more vials of water on Anthony as everything faded to darkness. But with sleep, I found myself somewhere else. Everything was shadowy and murky, like being underwater without the water. Dark shapes moved in the periphery of my vision. I remembered the father's words.
Anthony!
I screamed.
Anthony!
I looked around. Nothing. Just as I was about to call again, I heard it, faintly, I ran toward the sound of the voice, screaming his name over and over, changing direction as I was able to tell more and more where the voice was coming from. I felt shadowy hands grasp at me as I ran, but I wouldn't stop. I'd pull myself from them, fighting my way through. Finally, huddling on the ground by himself, I found Anthony. He seemed cloudy around the edges, but it was undeniably him. "Anthony," I said, reaching out my hand to him. "Take my hand. I'm going to get you back home." He reached out to me. I clasped his hand. It felt ephemeral and insubstantial, but there was enough there for me to hold on to. I ran back the way I had come, heading towards my entry point in the hopes it could be an exit as well. As I got lost, I heard a voice call through the shadows. "Melissa, come to my voice." It was Father Levine. I ran towards him, carrying Anthony along behind me. I saw him standing in a clearing, softly glowing. "Melissa, the next part will be tricky. I will send you back to your body, Anthony as well. Severet followed you in here, which means Anthony's body is vacant. I'm going to trap Severet. When you get back to our world, do not stop me, no matter what I do. Do you understand?" "I do." "Then go." With a wave of Father Levine's hand, ripples emanated across elsewhere, and I felt a ferocious pull. The next thing I knew, I was back in the chair in the corner of the room. Glancing up, I saw that Anthony was stirring on his bed, as well. He looked around his room and immediately began crying. Father Levine had been standing, still as a statue in the middle of the room, but he suddenly jerked back to life. "I condemn you to eternal damnation, Severet," he yelled. Grabbing another bottle of holy water, Father Levine opened it and poured it into his mouth. Swallowing, he spoke again. "I trap you in this body, Severet, and with the death of your prison, your reign shall end." Father Levine pulled out a long, thin knife, and as I screamed for him to stop, he drove it straight into his heart. I heard the horrible sound of Severet screaming again. For what I was realizing was the final time. Father Levine huffed to himself, then fell down to the floor. I dropped down to my knees next to him. "You're doing the work of good," he said, bubbles of blood on his lips. "The world needs you." He reached over and took my hand in his, and we stayed that way until long after he had died. I opened the door, and Carmichael burst into the room. Anthony ran to him and hugged him. They were crying, shedding tears of joy. I smiled briefly and nodded. Severet was gone. The threat was over. I could breathe again. It was time to check on Davion in the hospital and to see if Francine had returned to her body now that Severet was destroyed. Gathering up Father Levine's belongings, I made a promise to him. I won't give up.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy these stories, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and check out some more of my episodes here.